Hello, everybody. I have the pleasure of introducing my good friend Hunter Gsoell, who's going to talk to us about participation, liberating participation, and the thought of Owen Barfield. I think everyone here in our community brings some unique gift and some lesson to teach us all. Hunter, I know, takes very seriously this tension or polarity between the individual and the community, or between the freedom of the individual and the loving embrace of the community. And I think in isolation, these two things can become destructive or overly, a community without freedom can become too closed, and an individual without community can become too lonely and lost, really. And I think what Hunter has brought to our community is a sense for the importance of maintaining that polarity between freedom, the freedom of the individual, and the loving embrace of a community. And Hunter described himself as a tornado, and he really is a force of nature. I think his intense desire for knowledge will draw you in, and the intensity of his expression of those ideas will then fling you out again, but always with a renewed appreciation for the erotic allure of knowledge and ideas. And it's been wonderful these last few years to be flung around by your passion, Hunter, and I look forward to continuing the dialectic with you. So, welcome, Hunter.
Great. Thank you, Matt. All right, can everybody hear me okay? You good? Okay. So, the work I've been doing largely since I've got to the program has been a synthesis of my older passion of sort of this mystical pathway and mystical understanding of consciousness, and our philosophical trajectory, which we hold in this program. And what I'd like to talk about today is specifically a few terms that I have I've developed in both of these various pathways, particularly the coevolution of consciousness and nature, okay? And more deeply, the harmonizing aspect of consciousness and nature in manifestation as we know it. And these are terms that are extremely important in my particular mystical study, Kashmir Shaivism, that are also very particular in Barfield, who is really big for, as far as I understand it, all of our professors and therefore the whole program. So, the coevolution of consciousness and nature form a sort of underlying harmony. And at the confluence of these terms, which I'll be extrapolating in a minute, we find all manifestation and return. It's the foundational belief that needs to be carried forward for this talk, at least. So for Owen Barfield, the unrepresented and the represented are sort of the wait. It's funny because I was not nervous until exactly this moment. I wasn't nervous at all, and then all of a sudden it's hitting me all at once.
We love you, Hunter.
Thank you, Andres. So Owen Barfield came up with this groundbreaking work on what he called the unrepresented and the represented in terms of how we understand reality. And for him, the sort of supreme consciousness is the Word of God, and without that participation, none of this would really exist. Everything would be kind of this unmanifest, unrepresented, atomic sort of mess. Similarly, in Kashmir Shaivite metaphysics, Shakti, in her unmanifest and manifest state, participates with the universal consciousness, Shiva, moment to moment to moment. And so as I was reading Barfield, I kept on correlating these terms, and there was so much extrapolation and combination that I just started reading between my different texts and finding the ways in which they extrapolate. And ultimately, the key to these terms in both understanding Barfield's and Abhinavagupta's Kashmiri Shaivite understanding is the ongoing harmonizing and co-arising of consciousness and what we're calling the unrepresented, or the ground of all being. And that's the key to the evolution for Barfield of consciousness. So to harmonize and bring into focus these energies will lead us into the evolution of consciousness for Barfield. So what I want to talk about is how the experiential practice of Kashmiri Shaivism may offer the sort of guidance for the individual by which one can understand the ongoing communion between consciousness and nature, moment to moment to moment, so that we may individually and collectively affect the sort of evolution that Barfield and myself feel is necessary. So here's a quote from Barfield. The future of appearances, that is of nature herself, must depend on the direction which this evolution takes. So in Kashmiri Shaivism, the evolution, right, that co-harmonizing of consciousness and nature, in which every one of us is participating in moment to moment to moment to moment, is the ground and foundation of the practice itself. So here's a quote from the Yoga Spandakarika, which is a text central to Kashmiri Shaivism. And remember, consciousness is aligned with Shiva. Nature will extrapolate as being represented by Shakti in this pretty concrete manner, which I'll outline in a minute. All things emerge from the individual essence of the Tantrika, who recognizes herself to be Shiva Shakti. Everything in which she takes pleasure is Shiva Shakti. Thus there is no state which can be named which would not be Shiva Shakti. So therefore, from the outset, the Tantric practice understands the individual completely at the apex of consciousness and nature, moment to moment to moment to moment. And the liberating practice is to come into deeper harmony with that process, okay? Ultimately leading to Jivan Mukti, which is liberation in participation or liberation while alive. So that's a lot all at once. So I'd like to unpack and explore some of these terms, okay? First, we have the unrepresented, which is what Barfield talks about as kind of the particular matter which is not accessible to us. I think of quantum fluctuation and the depths of the quantum void or vacuum, which we cannot necessarily penetrate consciously. Yet, in participation is the ground of all existence and being. This is a beautiful definition of Shakti, which is understood in her unmanifest form to be exactly the pregnant void, to be exactly that ground of all essence and being from which everything arises and returns, the ground of all manifestation and return. So nature then would be Shakti manifest. When Barfield's talking about the participation with the unmanifest, he refers to these really esoteric and mystical imagery like the goddess Natura, who is necessarily infinitely mysterious in her manifestation, in her manifest aspect, right? In creative, basically in everything, in all things in nature. And is the ultimate mystery to which every single one of us and all things necessarily participate, moment to moment to moment. And in Kashmiri Shaivism, Shakti in her manifest form is the ongoing sort of veiling and unveiling of reality, moment to moment. It is the manifestation of all appearances and the return to the essence of the source of depth. She is the ultimate mystery in which consciousness participates to create and return all. So then consciousness, according to Barfield, is in its ultimate sense the mind of God, right? Because Barfield is coming from this very Christian metaphysics, and what he means by that is the ultimate ground of all knowledge and wisdom, to which each one of us participates to a greater or a lesser degree. And the ultimate goal of philosophy for Barfield and for, well, I think the ultimate goal of philosophy is to reach that ideal mind of God to the degree which one is able. So consciousness, in terms of Kashmiri Shaivism, is also the ultimate. It is the universal consciousness of Shiva that is at once totally universal and utterly transcendent beyond all, and simultaneously the ground of all individual and particular consciousness. And this is a very particular relationship with Shakti, because Shakti is understood in the play of Shiva and Shakti to be the sort of self-reflexive aspect of consciousness coming into communion with consciousness itself. So the individual manifestation is sort of consciousness turning back on itself and coming into consciousness. And hence the role of consciousness is both immanent and transcendent. It is utterly transcendent, but in its manifest form, consciousness comes into a sort of self-reflexive quality in and with and amongst itself, moment to moment to moment. And the ultimate goal of the Tantric practitioner, in the first sense, is to align oneself with such a universal consciousness at the apex of Shiva and Shakti. So starting to see how all these terms really correlate between Barfield and Kashmiri Shaivism. So in his book, Saving the Appearances, what Owen Barfield is pushing for is a movement from what he calls original participation, which is the subjective consciousness sort of unconsciously engaged in the manifestation moment to moment to moment, right? And he aligns this with sort of ancient beliefs in animism. So the idea that we project and create meaning on various objects, and we believe that meaning to be ultimate without consciously recognizing our role in representation and manifestation. So original participation is an unconscious engagement in the communion between consciousness and nature. This is deeply aligned with what we call the unawakened state of any given practitioner, who, not understanding their identification with the supreme consciousness, the supreme creativity of the universe, is sort of caught up in the appearances, the sensual realm, desires, without understanding their own sort of union with Shiva Shakti, with the ultimate consciousness and nature herself, creative moment to moment. That it's a very subtle movement from original to final participation for both of these practices. It's very difficult to identify because this process of creative communion is occurring moment to moment to moment to moment, and it is merely the degree to which one is aware and present within it. So in the unawakened state, one becomes wholly sort of caught up and identified with the very same sensual world, which is the liberation for an awakened tantrika, which is to say that the process is constantly occurring, and the only thing that's necessary is to come into total conscious participation. So to lead to the final participation in the awakened state, Barfield recommends and calls for arising from potentia to act, from potential to act. So the idea is one can become conscious of being a co-creative aspect of the universe, for instance. I can, in my sort of meta-level thinking, understand what it means to be consciousness and nature in participation. However, to actually raise that potential into act and go into the absolute participation in the ongoing generative and cosmic act, the union between consciousness and nature, raises imagination from potential into a creative agent in the universe. And this is fairly similar to the awakened state of Tantric enlightenment, in which the Tantrika, through and with engagement in the sensual realm, comes into absolute participation with Shiva and Shakti moment to moment to moment. And the end result is an utter immanence and a dissolving into the true nature of the heart, which is identified with the universal consciousness and nature, and simultaneously the whole of existence simultaneously. And this residing and meditation into the true nature of the heart at once identifies the Tantrika not only at the apex of the union of consciousness and nature, but simultaneously into a sort of radical non-duality in which he or she participates in that communion between consciousness and nature, along with all manifestation, moment to moment to moment, ultimately leading to liberation and participation. Fully liberated and completely participating in the ongoing manifestation and return of all things through the interplay of Shiva and Shakti. Okay, so no big deal, right? Let's just do that. So, in conclusion, what I'm really trying to stress is the critical importance of sensual engagement. I think that that's what Kashmiri Shaivism has to offer. The way that I put it in a paper last fall is that the way is not out, but through, right? If we're understanding all necessarily to be the union, the communion of consciousness and nature, which is identified with both the heart as microcosm, which resonates with heart as macrocosm, right? The heart is simultaneously singular and universal. And if we understand consciousness and nature to be participating with every realm of manifestation moment to moment, practices can be developed in order to engage consciously in the evolution of manifestation towards a more conscious participation for everybody. So here's two quotes from Barfield. First, it is clear that the way of the West lies not back but forward, not in withdrawal from the contacts of the senses, but in their transformation and redemption. And then later, the cosmos of wisdom should have its perennial source, not without and behind the appearances, but within the consciousness of man, not in front of his senses and figuration, but behind them.
Hunter, will you read the first one again?
Yeah, no problem. It is clear that the way of the West lies not back, but forward, not with withdrawal from contact of the senses, but in their transformation and redemption. And this transformation and redemption of the sensual realm is the MO of Tantric practice. The primary difference between Tantric and, let's say, Buddhist or Advaita Vedantist practice is that there is no escape. Consciousness and nature in manifestation and return, here and now, imminently, are the only access that we have to the universal powers of, say, liberation, which are necessary for the radical transformation of reality. So for the next phase of human consciousness, what I'm calling for is sort of an imminent collapse of teleology, essentially, because the end goal of all teleology is effected radically by the Tantrika in the moment of enlightenment. The absolute communion of consciousness and nature, right, is affected in the body and spirit of the Tantrika, moment to moment to moment, right? So the key difference between, for instance, this and a Christian metaphysics is there is no eschatology. There is no final moment at which these two forces, nature and God, will ultimately come together. It is affected in the body of the Tantrika, moment to moment to moment. And through experiential practices such as Kashmir Shaivism, which understands these forces to be constantly in communion, we can reach the next phase in the evolution of human consciousness, in which every single one of us is communally and individually participating in the ongoing harmony and coevolution of consciousness and nature. That would be nice. So, that's it. I realize I just unloaded a lot on all of you, so if anybody has any questions, I open.
I kind of do. So it sounded like you said something to the effect of, you said these sort of separately, so I want to make sure that I have this right, but liberation as a radical transformation. Is that the idea?
Uh-huh.
So I always think, and my experience in the traditions that I've studied, that is that liberation is sort of the end of transformation. And so in Tantrism, it's
the beginning. So the idea is that liberation and participation is the first step, and to come deeper and deeper into harmony with the sensual manifest realm is an ongoing lifelong process which begins for the Tantrika but never ends, right? There isn't this conception of an end goal like in most spiritual practices, because, all is ultimately open and, universally potential. So that moment of liberation and participation is really crucial, and that's exactly what I was trying to get you all to, because to be fully liberated and absolutely engaged simultaneously is Jivan Mukti. That is the ultimate goal of tantric practice, and that liberation is the universal consciousness, and that participation is Shakti in her manifest form, and the individual exists at that tension and apex simultaneously, moment to moment to moment. Right? And once that meditation or that practice begins, one is enveloped in that process for the rest of one's life and cannot escape, right? There is no transcendent, happy, cushy Brahman to go to. One is fully enveloped in the sensual realm and completely responsible. There is no escape. There is no sitting on a mountaintop, right? Although, you could do that if you want. I'm not objecting to sitting on mountaintops. It's a wonderful thing. But you're always participating whether you like it or not. Shannon Stearns. Get you in a second, Matt.
Beautiful.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Shannon.
So, in my immersion in the last couple of years into Kashmir Shaiva Tantra, one of my teachers emphasized the term nature essence. So, it just struck me with your emphasis upon nature, that relationship. And what that means is that we are all in our unconditioned state. Nature essence is our unadulterated, immanent expression of Shiva, or absolute consciousness. And I just want to share a powerful quote that was really epiphanic for me from the same teacher, that that sort of contrast with Buddhist concepts of Anatman or no self, which is really challenging for me, and actually feels in some ways desecrating of the sanctity of individuality. He said, of all the things absolute consciousness could have chosen to become, it chose to become you, and you, and you, and you. Like, so beautiful. But accessing that nature essence, I wonder if anything, and you know, what you just constellated might inform that. How do we, I think all of us sort of have this sense of like, when I'm at my most real, at my most right self. And I feel waves of that throughout the day. And there's many, you know, experiential practices in this tradition that help access that. Any form of meditation can really help access that. But I just wonder if you have anything to say about that nature essence.
Absolutely. So 2 things came to mind immediately: microcosm, macrocosm, and the contraction expansion of Shakti. So I'll go with microcosm, macrocosm is a little bit more complex. So the contraction and the expansion of Shakti is the foundation and the ground of each individual existence. So the problem is not to be ego-identified in Kashmir Shaivism. We don't consider this a problem or something to be overcome. It is a moment in the ongoing harmonizing and communion of consciousness and nature, in which Shakti contracts into all individual manifestations simultaneously, including the individual ego and every cell in one's body, and so on and so forth. And each of those tiny microcosms is simultaneously identified with the macrocosm. See, it's a very complex, we call it a dual non-duality, right? And the individual essence, as the contraction of Shakti, is constantly in a process of expanding. So that's the Kundalini energy. The contraction and the expansion, this is the final realization, are simultaneous. Oneself can only be known to be contracted and individualized because of the constant and ongoing process of communion with the total. The individual nature and essence, as the contraction of Shakti, is simultaneously the point. It's like a very fine point of communion at which the individual is simultaneously oneself and the whole. The individual self and the individual essence and the true nature of the essence is that moment at which the contraction and the expansion meet. And harmonizing and living in that space is the spanda. To understand that the confluence of all of the forces of the universe individuates as Shannon Stearns in this moment, so that Shannon Stearns can expand to embrace the entire universe. That is the spanda, and that is the liberating energy of Kashmir Shaivism. So, yeah. Also, the thing about macrocosm really quick is each microcosm on the minute level is identified with universal macrocosm. So duality necessitates non-duality, non-duality necessitates duality in that sense. That was incredibly brief, but Matt.
It's really rich the way you're bringing together Barfield with Shaivism, and I wanted to draw you out a little bit more about your response to or reaction to Barfield's Christianity, because, you know, on the face of it, Christianity can seem a very dualistic tradition that emphasizes the separation of God from the world and the uniqueness of Jesus as emphasizing his divinity over his humanity and so on. But on the other hand, there are esoteric streams of Christianity, like the one that Barfield's emerging from, in which a lot of his inspiration comes from Rudolf Steiner, who's inspired by Romanticism and alchemy and the deep wisdom of the West that has always been sort of on the heretical outskirts of the mainline church.
Right.
And with many of these more esoteric streams, the duality in Christianity it still plays an important role, a sort of initiatory role, in the sense that even Jesus on the cross said, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" In that last moment, he lost faith and had to, you know, as Rick was saying last night, if there's not that risk of really thinking you're going to die and then all is lost, you don't get the depth of initiation into, you know, that final participation. So So I wonder if you think that this, the duality that seems so obviously at the forefront of the Christian spiritual path could in some way be seen as a initiatory tool to lead from that original participation where there's that kind of unconscious union with the cosmos without any kind of individual sense of one's creative potential. Through this, what Barfield refers to the evolution of the West out of that animistic, enchanted cosmos as a kind of like we reached this null point, like with Descartes, where the self was totally separate from nature,
Right.
And over and against the nature that, as it appeared to us, was just thought of as an illusion, and that what it really was this mechanism that we couldn't really access with our senses, and it's kind of an incoherent scheme in the way Barfield will deconstruct it, but the purpose of that disenchantment was so that we could become free as individual selves, and then choose consciously to love nature again, to love the world again. And I wonder do you see any value in that narrative that includes dualism as one of its moments? Do you buy this important distinction between original and final participation, and do you think that it requires that dualism?
Absolutely. I think that what's so intriguing to me about Barfield in relation to Kashmir Shaivism is a dual, non-dual structure. And that dual aspect is extremely important and unique because that's what holds the realm of manifestation. It's the separation in that moment of the dance of Shiva and Shakti by which all may come into manifestation so that it can come into a deeper underlying harmony. So to use the Christian metaphysic, nature and God needed to become split so that the individual could differentiate. It's like Shiva and Shakti need to go into their dance so the individual can come to find oneself at the apex, at the confluence of those forces in order to come into a deeper, more radical and evolutionary harmony. And so in that regard, in the esoteric sense, I very much align with the Christian imagery and symbology. I think it's actually extremely similar to Tantra. Actually, I think a lot, it also comes from alchemy, and all of these various pathways are saying very similar things. I just happened to get on board with Kashmir Shaivism because it made the most sense to me, With the Christian metaphysic in particular, what I take challenge with is the narrative. The sense of a finite beginning and a finite end. This is problematic for me because the way in which I experience the universal energies that be, they're finite only insofar as they are infinite. Like the finite quality relates to infinity. So to say or to postulate that, there's this creative act at the beginning and then there will be this ultimate communion at the end and that's it. And it just doesn't really vibe with me. It's not the way that I view life and energy. So just in terms of, but ultimately, and what I was working on here, I actually had a kind of different presentation debating the Christian metaphysics with the Kashmiri Shaivite one in that sense, but I dropped that completely. What I'm more interested in is how can Tantric practice illuminate any metaphysical schema in order for one to come more deeply into communion between consciousness and nature, between the goddess Natura and Christ, or, the Godhead, for instance, in experience and in practice, moment to moment to moment.
I think probably wrap up soon, but does anyone else have a question?
Good question.
Coming from Taoist thought, which doesn't divorce consciousness from nature, and they're completely intertwined, it sounded like what you were saying within Tantric Shaivism is that this is the natural interplay, it's ongoing, and then we discover our own role in how to interact with it over the course of our lifetime. Within Taoist thought, they put that natural state as something that we're born into, having that universal consciousness, and then it's through sort of social, cultural, like the things that we get away from that,
Right.
and then have to work our way back towards that original state of like the newborn baby. And what it sounded like was that there's within Shaivism there's a separation at entrance, and then it's a rediscovery or a refinement of sensual experience.
Maybe I misspoke at some point. No, I think that I'm just intuitively, I think about a newborn baby is fully awakened in the sensual realm. Probably the most awakened we're ever going to be in our entire lives. And you're right, social and cultural conditioning teaches us that we are disambiguated and separated and differentiated. And when one exists purely in that realm without a greater conception of the universal consciousness and love which underlies all and interpenetrates all and all, one gets caught up in the illusion of desires and, sensual appearances and so on and so forth, and one is jailed by those very forces which would otherwise liberate the awakened tantrika, right? So a baby has no conception of trying to seize or grasp the, what it desires. It is in a constant flowing communicative relationship with the totality of sensual experience. And if I ever made it seem like consciousness and nature, Shiva and Shakti, are ever divorced from one another, that was a huge misnomer. Shiva is Shakti. Shiva is the, masculine, feminine. The body of Shiva is Shiva Shakti. He has a left breast, for instance. It's really important in the imagery. And that contraction of Shakti essence, which is all manifestation and return, is understood to be the self-reflexivity of Shiva's own consciousness as Shakti. So the moment of differentiation is the moment at which the universal consciousness comes into self-reflexive sort of communion and play with itself. So you could see it as a differentiation, but only as a differentiation of lovers when they're dancing. We have to go apart so that we can create a more complex dance within and around one another. And that's the foundation of manifestation and return of all things.
Continue on the lawn.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.